happened with me the first time that I visited Andalus. I visited Andalus the first time on my own. I just rented a car and I spent a solid 8-9 days driving up and down southern Spain, and I had my own itinerary. So I didn't really go with the tour that has its pros and cons. I wouldn't advise it generally speaking, but I had an interesting time. So I was in Granada, and Granada was the very last stronghold of the Muslims. And Granada fell in the year 1492. Now, every single person who's been through high school, middle school, even elementary school, knows 1492 for another reason. And that reason is the quote-unquote discovery of America by Columbus, okay? Now, when I went, this was over 10 years ago, I went a very long time ago, I had studied the history of Andalus through the Muslim perspective, through the Arabic books, up until the fall of Andalus, and I had stopped. So I was taking a tour of Andalus with a professional guide, and she was taking me around all the sites of the Granada, of the famous palace in Granada. And she said, and this is a memorial over here where Christopher Columbus was standing when the final sultan of the Granadan Empire, the Nasrid Empire, handed the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, I had studied the Islamic side at that time. I hadn't really studied the Western side. And it really struck me like, what? Christopher Columbus, how did he enter this narrative? What is Christopher Columbus doing standing next to the Sultan of the Nasrid Empire when they're handing the keys over? How did Columbus enter my version of history of the Muslims of Spain? Because I hadn't studied 10 years ago the Western books of history. And my guide said, don't you know, Christopher Columbus was pestering Ferdinand and Isabella year after year to finance his campaign to go to discover a route to India. Because of course they wanted to bypass the Muslims and get to the spices and the trade and the goods without the Islamic middle world, because they wanted to cut back the profits, right? So of course, like any man, he got lost and he refused to ask for directions, so he ended up over here in America. But the point being that she told me that, don't you know that he was for years asking for money, and Ferdinand and Isabella kept on telling him that, no, we can't finance your expedition because we're busy fighting the Muslims. So he was literally following them around, waiting for an opportunity that he can get his money. And of course, when the Islamic Empire of Granada, when the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada fell in January 1492, Christopher Columbus was right there in the audience. He witnessed the keys of the city being handed from the Sultan to Ferdinand and Isabella. And that very same key is on display to this day. That very exact same key is on display. You can see it. When we go, inshallah, to Granada, you will see it. So when the keys were handed over, now Christopher Columbus basically said, what's your excuse now? I need the money. And Ferdinand and Isabella now actually had access to a large fortune. And that fortune was the treasury of the Granadan kingdom. The Islamic treasury, essentially the banks of Granada. Well, not the banks, but you get the treasury reserve, basically, right? So the Muslim wealth of Nasrid Spain is now at the disposal of Ferdinand and Isabella. And Christopher Columbus is right there in the room, and at Granada, in the Nasrid palace, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the decree that, okay, we're going to assign you so much money, you can purchase 3 ships, and you're going to go on your expedition to quote unquote discover the road to India. Now my guide told me, and this was I think back in 2006 or something, like almost 10 years ago. My guide told me, if you're in America and you really want to, you can go to the very village where Christopher Columbus stayed for 6 months. And the actual house that he lived in, the actual church that he stayed in, is still standing with his furniture, and some of the maps or whatever is still over there. So, being the patriotic American that I am, I said, okay, I have to change my whole program, spend an entire day driving to this little village, this little hut. I'm in the middle of nowhere. Nobody goes. It's a small fishing village that is completely off the maps. So I drove all the way down. It's called La Rabida. You'll find it on Google Maps. Do La Rabida. And I went to La Rabida, and there's only one tourist site in all of La Rabida, and that is Christopher Columbus's monastery, Christopher Columbus's church that he stayed in before embarking on his expedition to America. And it was completely dead. I was the only tourist. Like, you have to drive 2 hours to get to this little fishing village. Who's going to do that, right? So I drove all the way there. There was absolutely nobody else, in the entire monastery. It's a small monastery. It's as large as this room, basically, as large as this room, 2 stories and whatnot. And I walk in for the ticket office, and the lady who's selling the ticket gets excited. She sees me, and she goes, she speaks in Spanish, and she asked, si habla español, do you speak Spanish? And I said, I am from Texas, but no si habla español, si habla Urdu, but no si habla español. So she tries to communicate in broken English and French and Spanish, and she recognizes me as a Muslim, and she goes, you are Musliman? I said, yes, I'm a Muslim. So she said, this church was a masjid. This church, la mosque, la mezquita, it's a mosque. And she was so excited to see a Muslim, she actually became an unofficial tour guide for me. She left the post, not that there was a long line, like nobody's there, right? And she took me inside the monastery, and she showed me that, look, this was where the mihrab was, right? They've covered it up. That was where the minaret was, and they cut it off and they put a cross over there. And she showed me how it was a masjid, but after the reconquest, after the Christians reconquered it, they converted it into a monastery or a church. And so Christopher Columbus slept and lived in a masjid for 6 months. For 6 months, he's sleeping in the masjid, living in the masjid. Of course, it's now been converted to a church by the time he's there. But it is essentially built by the Muslims, right? And he's being financed by the Muslims. The money is coming from basically the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. And of course, the technology that he employed was technology that the Arabs and the Muslims had invented and had perfected. So the quote-unquote discovery of America is directly linked to the civilization of Islam. And it's not a coincidence. It's not just 1492 just doesn't come out of thin air. The two are causally related. The fall of Granada facilitated, it was the direct cause for the discovery of America, the quote-unquote discovery of America. So this is just one facet that really explains to us how linked, how intertwined the history of Granada is, not just to Islam overall, not just to the Muslim world, not just to Europe, but especially to us here in America. Now obviously time is very limited. I literally only have like 15-20 minutes. And what I wanted to do is very briefly, just for the benefit of all of us, because we only have 15-20 minutes, I strongly feel that the history of Andalus is something that, especially us American Muslims, we should at least know the very basic outline of. We should all be vaguely familiar with what happened over there. Because the history of Andalus in particular, the Islamic history of Andalus, is especially important for us. Why? Well, because, as Brother Tariq said, that the Islamic civilization of Andalus is in the heart of Europe. It's not an external phenomenon. It is flourishing inside of Europe. And the people that are there, the Muslims that are there, are European. There was barely a handful of Arabs and Muslims that came. The rest of them are local converts. And by the time the Muslims leave Spain, they're kicked out of Andalus, up to 70 to 80% of the local people were Muslims. These are Europeans. Abdurrahman III, the famous Khalifa that if you ever study any book, you're going to study Abdurrahman III. Abdurrahman III was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Latin or Castilian speaking. He spoke both languages fluently, absolutely fluently. The Khalifa of Andalus is European, externally and internally. And of course, there's also the Arab blood in him because his father is from the Umayyads. His mother was a princess from one of the Castilian kingdoms there. So quite literally that blend of East and West is perfectly manifested. As well, Andalus is no doubt about it, the cultural capital of the medieval Islamic world. The level of civilization as measured in the arts and the sciences and the architecture, the level of sophistication and technology, it is simply unparalleled. You know, all of us, we talk about the achievements of Islam, the various inventions, the surgeons, the alchemy. Most of it, not all, most of it took place in Andalus. The bulk of these technological and scientific advancements that we're so proud of, you hear since you're growing up in Sunday school, the bulk of them took place in Andalus. Why? Because the Andalusian culture was simply unparalleled for its time. People from all over the world could come, regardless of their religion, and science was being shared between Muslim, Christian, and Jew, between East and West. There was a level of civility, of the convivia is what it's called, that it's literally everybody is able to come to the table as an equal when it comes to science. And Christians and Jews are welcomed, and Muslims benefit from them, and they benefit from the Muslims as well. Now, one of the reasons as well that Andalus is so important is because along with all the good, there's also the bad. In the end of the day, the brutal fact of the matter, we have no other example like Andalus in our entire history. Andalus is the largest piece of land that was a part of the Ummah and is no longer a part of the Ummah. No doubt Palestine is under occupation, but the Muslims of Palestine are still there. There's still Muslims in Palestine. And of course, the occupation is brutal. In Andalus, the Muslims were forced to convert or cleansed or ethnically cleansed or kicked out. So there are no more mass, Muslims in Andalus. There's still, families that know that their heritage is Islamic, and the conversion is increasing. But by and large, there's less than 1% Muslims in Andalusia now, right? Whereas once upon a time, it was 80, 90%. In some areas in Qurtuba, 90% Muslims used to live there. Now, of course, Qurtuba is less than 1% Muslim. So we don't have any other parallel. There are small pockets, Cyprus and others, that there was some Arab or Islamic presence for 100 or 200 years, then they were expelled. But nothing as large and as glorious and as magnificent as Andalus. So the question arises, and every serious student of history needs to study this, why? Why did we lose Andalusia? Why did we have so much izzah and power, and yet all of it was taken away in the span of a century or two? And those, when you go do your research, you see, unfortunately, that the rulers and even the Muslim population had lost sense of their own priorities. Unfortunately, there was political intrigue. People began to prefer the dunya over the akhirah. The Islamic identity began to wax and wane. Muslim rulers regularly sought help from Christian kings against other Muslim rulers, because the Andalusian society fractured up into many kingdoms. And in order to preserve their kingdoms, fast forward to current times right now with the Muslim world in the Middle East, in order to protect their mini countries, they have no problems hiring Christian lands to fight other Muslim nations to protect their own territories. And this is what we see of proxy wars that are currently going on right now. And if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. So very briefly, what I want everybody to know, and if you have some way to take notes, it's going to be a benefit. This is the bird's eye view of the bird's eye view of a brief history of Islam in Spain. I want to divide the history of Islam in Spain into a number of overall eras. And I want everybody to know these eras. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I do believe that it is important. Just like we're aware of the basics of the American Revolution, the overall, the trends of our American history, so too I believe American Muslims especially, and all Western Muslims, should have a very basic idea of Andalusian history. The first time frame begins at 711. Very simple date to remember, right? 711, memorize it from the stores, right? 711. Just that's the date when everything begins. 711 to 929. That's the first time frame, 929. From 711 to 929, we have the Umayyad Emirate. We have a province that is semi-independent, and it is called the Umayyad Emirate. Now, why is it called the Umayyad Emirate? Because its ruler was from the previous Umayyad dynasty, but they never gave their oath of allegiance to the current Abbasid Caliphate. So they're semi-independent, and of course, the founder of this is Abdurrahman the First, and his story is literally as if it's out of the 1001 Nights, where the Abbasids massacred all of the Umayyads other than a handful, and Abdurrahman was one of the few who basically was saved, and he fled for his life, and he spent 2.5 years running on his own, literally without any help and aid, and he made his way to Andalus, and he established his own mini dynasty over there. So he revived the legacy of Andalusia for around 200 years. So from 711 to 929, Andalus is basically now established as an Umayyad dynasty. The primary cities of Qurtuba, of Sevilla, of Granada, all of these primary cities of Toledo, Torreytala up north, all of these are established. What happens in 929? In 929, the Umayyads feel so powerful that they officially break away from the Abbasid Caliphate, and they declare they are the Khalifa as well. So for the first time, the Muslim Ummah has 2 Khalifas. That's a negative. There's some negatives there, because technically you're not supposed to. Nonetheless, and this also shows us the beginning of the end, that perhaps in hindsight that wasn't the wisest thing to do. Nonetheless, they feel so powerful, they establish their own caliphate. And so the Caliph Abdurrahman III, the one I told you about, Abdurrahman III, he establishes the caliphate, and he says, I am the Khalifa of the West. Just like you guys have a Khalifa in the East, I am the Khalifa of the West. Now what's really interesting here, the Khalifa of the East and the Khalifa of the West have Europe right dead center between them. The Islamic world, it's as if it's surrounding Europe. And you had European emissaries coming to the East and also going to the West. And so the West was not the Western world. If you said the West back then, you actually meant the Muslim world. Because the westernmost part of the world, in the 1100s, 900s, 1000s, the westernmost part of the world was the Islamic world of Andalusia. So 929 is the next era until 1031. Around 100 years, 929 to 1031, this is the Umayyad Caliphate. Not the Umayyad Emirate, but a Caliphate. They have an entire caliphate, and some say this is the pinnacle and also the beginning of the end, because it's the pinnacle because they built an entire city infrastructure. We will see, if those of you that are able to go with us next year, inshallah, we will see the city that they built, Madinat al-Zahra. It's a beautiful, magnificent city, absolutely stunning architecture, that which remains of it. At the same time, there was so much spending and so much extravagance that some say it was the financing of the city that was the beginning of the decline. That they spent so much money to boast about their power and their prestige that kind of began the end of the, if you like, the decline of the Umayyads. So from 1031 onwards to, let's just say, roughly 1086, that's around 50 years, this is when Andalusia fractures into mini dynasties. Quite literally over 30 mini countries. Because with the collapse of the Caliphate, what happens, every city becomes independent. Literally, every city declares its independence. Now what's going to happen? They're fighting with each other for power, right? You're not going to have a flourishing of Islam if small entities are fighting one another rather than fighting the enemies that were willing to conquer them. There were attempts to reconquer and solidify. Allah gave them some leeway, because Allah never destroys a nation immediately. He gives them some chance, and that chance was given by external dynasties coming in. And these are the 2 dynasties, the Murabitun and the Muwahhidun. They came from North Africa. They came from Algeria, from Morocco, from Tunisia. They came in and they tried to re-solidify. They tried to retain, rather than lose it to the Christians, they attempted to. But in the end of the day, it did not work, and therefore the Reconquista begins. The Reconquista means the reconquering. The Reconquista means the reconquering, and the reconquering began in 1032 and lasted obviously until 1492. So for 400 years, the Christians are reconquering one city after another. In 1032, they start reconquering Toledo. By the way, Toledo is the northernmost city. In Arabic, it's called Torreytala. Toledo is the northernmost city in all of Andalusia. So they eventually reconquer Torreytala, Toledo, and then it takes them around 200 years to reconquer everything that the Muslims had. So technically in 1238, not 1492, in 1238, Andalusia was no longer Muslim. other than one province. And that province was the province of Granada, right? So in 1238, the entire land of Andalusia essentially was under Christian rule, other than the one province of Granada, and the people of Granada had to pay exorbitant taxes. They were taxed to their teeth. They had to pay gold and silver to the neighboring Christian kingdoms in order to remain independent or semi-independent, and that independence lasted until 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella finally united. They married together and they united the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, and they decided to basically eliminate the Muslims. But that's not the end of Islamic Granada. From 1492 to 1722 is the final time frame. This is the time frame of Islam as a persecuted minority in Andalusia. You see, imagine in 1492, imagine the city is an Islamic city. Almost 95% of the people in the city are Muslim. When Ferdinand and Isabella come and conquer it, they cannot just get rid of all the Muslims. They can't. In fact, they can't even persecute the Muslims because they need the Muslims to run the city. You can't have a city without people. So they promise the Muslims, you stay here, we'll protect you, you pay taxes to us, and you have religious freedom. But within a decade, the persecution began. And within 2-3 decades, they were pressured to convert. Within 100 years, the decree came, you must convert, the Inquisition. And if you don't convert, you will be killed or persecuted. And slowly but surely, the Muslims had to navigate through. What are we going to do now? Are we allowed to stay? Can we leave? If we leave, where are we going to go? If we stay, to what level of compromise are we allowed in the books of fiqh? So they stopped them from praying Jumu'ah. And so people would literally just on Friday gather together in their houses and just have a quick Fatiha or something. That's in lieu of Salat al-Jumu'ah. They were not allowed to have Qur'ans, so they would hide their Qur'ans. They would build, if you like, secret compartments in their houses to hide the Qur'an, because the inquisiting police, the inquisitors would come and they would literally search their houses in the middle of the night. And there are authentic reports of women hiding the Qur'an, and astaghfirullah, we shouldn't do this except in this case, between their legs, so that the Quran is preserved and not destroyed by the Reconquista. There are horrible stories of persecution and torture and inquisitions. Muslims are taken to trial for being secret Muslims, because technically by don't quote me on this, is it 1570 or something, you're not even allowed to be a Muslim by that time. Right, 80 years or so, you can't even be a Muslim. So what did the Muslims do? They verbally said they're Christian, but they kept their Islam secret from the government. Now, obviously, this is the time of the Catholic Church. This is the time of the Inquisition. And so they would persecute the Muslims. They would test them by forcing them to eat pork and drink wine. So they would literally go to their houses and tell them, eat pork. Now, every Muslim sitting here, what's going to happen? May Allah protect me and you. What's going to happen when you put that pork in your mouth? You're going to feel disgust. Because honestly, this is true. Everybody knows this. If you're not accustomed to that taste of meat, it is actually very disgusting. Right? You feel disgusted. And wine, alhamdulillah, I've never drank wine or eat pork, but we live in this country. You pass by an open bottle of beer or something, and honestly, it smells filthy. It smells it's fermented grape juice. Imagine, right? That's what it is. So when you're forced to drink that, what's going to happen? And you're not accustomed to it. You're going to, some facial expression. That was the test. That was the test. Let's see if you can eat pork and drink wine. And subhanAllah, when we visited Spain, one of the things that's really bizarre, wherever you go, in every restaurant, you find big, pork basically hanging, pig legs, pig heads hanging from average restaurants. And it is said, this is the theory, that these were done in order to make the Muslims feel as if this is not your land, in order to test the Muslims. To this day, when you go to Andalusia, the average restaurant, and we had to go to restaurants, and even I went to a restaurant to have lunch, and you walk in, and of course you're ordering the vegetarian option, and right behind the counter there's these massive, pork heads, and these, steaks of pork and whatnot, just over over there, wherever you go. And it really demonstrates that anti-Islamic culture that existed. They wanted to eliminate Islam. And do you know the last trial that took place in Andalusia over a secret Muslim, over a closet Muslim? That was the term we can now use, a closet Muslim. Do you know the last trial? 1722. Where a family was dragged to court and accused of being a Muslim. 1722.